he was out in the waiting room and saw some image of an angel and saw the wings, and somehow wings struck him. Paul was pushing this idea, why don't we just do some concerts in a small club? The university tour, in a way, was Paul working out finally an idea that he brought up towards the end of the Beatles as something he wanted to do.
From the moment Mick and Keith met through to U2 as a high school band in Dublin, how did our biggest music legends make the leap? Passion, talent, luck, and even scandal often came together to propel these stars from obscurity to household name. The stories, the journey, the wild behind the scenes, and much more. I'm Dave Anthony, and I'm the host of From Garage to Stadiums.
Welcome to Garage to Stadiums. Today's episode is the story of Paul McCartney. Before the stadium lights and the knighthood, there was a 15-year-old guitarist who blew away a restless band leader named John Lennon. When the band needed a bassist, the young guitarist named Paul was a team player and agreed to the shift. And soon, he and John were writing songs that would redefine popular music. Inside a band the world would come to know as the Beatles. When that empire collapsed under tension, ambition, and exhaustion, the question wasn't whether McCartney had been successful, it was whether he would be successful again, without the banner, without the brothers, without the myth. What followed was not a smooth second act. It began as a retreat, reinvention, a new band built from scratch, new personalities, new pressures, and eerily familiar fault lines would begin to appear on the horizon. Creative friction, fragile egos, addictions. Yet the songs kept coming, hits, misses, and masterpieces. All carried the fingerprints of a man unwilling to fade quietly into history. What you're about to hear is the story of what happens after you've already conquered the world and have to prove you can do it again. Here to tell the post-Beatles story of Paul McCartney is Alan Kozin, the co-author of a 2-volume pair of books called The McCartney Legacy, a retrospective of Paul McCartney's career from the end of the Beatles onward. Alan is best known for his 37-year tenure at the New York Times, covering classical music and what was called the Beatles desk. He currently contributes reviews for the Wall Street Journal. The first volume of his works on McCartney covers the years 69 to 73. Volume 2 picks up from 74 to 1980. And Rolling Stone described the book as comprehensive, painstaking, dazzling, and a definitive chronicle. The Weekend Mail of the UK said of the book the following, quote, "If the devil is in the detail, then the McCartney legacy is positively satanic." Alan joins us today from Portland, Maine. Welcome to Garage to Stadiums, Alan.
Thanks, Dave. Great to be here.
Your works on the Beatles and Paul McCartney are extensive and impressive.
It's funny, I grew up studying classical music, and most of my actual career was covering classical music for the New York Times. But I also grew up during that period when the Beatles were a current band. I saw them on the Ed Sullivan Show, all that stuff that people of my generation always say. And I got sort of obsessive about them, even though I was studying classical stuff and playing classical stuff. And in writing about it, I always kept very close tabs on the Beatles world as a group. And then after they broke up as soloists, I was at the Times. There was an instance where the chief pop critic wrote a review of a Beatles video production that wasn't actually what it claimed to be. So I sent him a note explaining what it was. And after that, he said, listen, why don't you basically do the Beatles stuff? So I became the Times Beatle desk, basically. So that was fun.
Was there parallels between classical and the Beatles that kind of led you to make a pretty easy leap to the next lily pad?
As they got on to 1966, 1967, they began doing a lot of experimental stuff that to me was as fascinating as what classical composers were doing.
To start to tell this story, it's important to start with Paul's personality and the Beatles empire nearing its end at the end of the 1960s. We all know the success of the Beatles as pioneers of modern music. Their popularity was enormous. And among the Beatles, Paul was thought to be the cute one, the creative one. and immensely popular himself. Paul began dating British actress Jane Asher way back in 63 as the Beatles were becoming a major act. He even lived with Jane Asher's family from 63 to 66 when they offered him a room in the attic, and he wrote many of his famous tunes there. Despite this arrangement, your book talks about several affairs while he dated her, and that he even was seeing someone just 2 weeks before he ended up marrying Linda in 69. Tell us a little bit about that, what your view of Paul in that light is.
Keeping in mind that Paul was at that point the most eligible bachelor among the Beatles, the only bachelor among the Beatles, the rest were married, and he was the last holdout. And when they were on tour, John Lennon used to say we were like Satyricon on tour. When we hit a town, we hit it. There were girls all over the place, really, for all of them. And that was what Paul was used to. But in the UK, Jane was his girlfriend and they were engaged for a while, and he was still seeing other people. I talk about that in volume 1 of the book because they were pretty open relationships. There's film of him with Francie Schwartz, who he lived with briefly. And the other person you're talking about, he was still seeing until just shortly before he married Linda, was someone named Maggie McGivern, who he had been seeing on and off since maybe 1965. So, and that was just really a friendship with benefits, although it turned out that she actually would have wanted to marry him. And the one time he brought up marriage, she downplayed the idea. And so it went away. But when we say he saw her just before he married Linda, he really just went over to explain that he wasn't going to be able to see her anymore because he was getting married. So that doesn't really count that much as an active relationship at that point.
Paul gained more than a wife via Linda. Linda's father was New York City native Lee Eastman and was a show business lawyer. He was originally born Leopold Epstein, but changed his name to Lee Eastman. When the Beatles manager Brian Epstein, no relation to Lee, died in August 1967, Paul eventually approached Linda's father, Lee, for advice on who should manage the Beatles, and Eastman began representing Paul. Tell us about who Linda McCartney was, her family background.
Lee Eastman was her father, and she had a brother, John, and sister, Laura. Lee and John were lawyers, and Lee was actually a pretty well-known entertainment lawyer, and he did a lot in music publishing. Apart from publishing, the Eastmans were art collectors. They were very cultured people, and Paul was always a sucker for that, and so he fell right into that scene pretty easily. The thing is that in the family, Linda was like the black sheep. She was, as a young girl, she used to go to rock and roll shows in Brooklyn. She saw all of the people who were Paul's heroes, Buddy Holly and Little Richard and all of these people in the late 50s. And she came to the relationship knowing an awful lot of the music that Paul was into and having seen the original people playing it, which Paul in a lot of cases hadn't. Plus, by then, she was a photographer. She started in 1966 photographing the Rolling Stones, and then got a lot of assignments, got cover assignments for Rolling Stone, took lots of pictures of Hendrix and basically everybody who was big at the time. And when she went to London and finally met Paul, she was there to photograph for a book called Rock and Other Four-Letter Words. She was doing the photography and someone else was writing it. And she arranged to get an invitation to a party Brian Epstein was having for the Sgt. Pepper album, which was about to come out. She actually had met Paul a few nights earlier at a club called the Bag of Nails in London. And so she saw him again at that party. So that's Linda.
And basically, as you said, in marrying her, he gained more than a wife. He gained the Eastmans ultimately representing him. But first we get to the tumultuous Alan Klein versus Lee Eastman showdown, the management showdown. Paul marries Linda on March 12th, 1969, and 2 weeks later, Lennon marries Yoko Ono, March 30th. Is it just a coincidence that they both married in the same month? Was this another aspect of their rivalry?
I think it probably was a coincidence, except that you could say it was in the air. But I don't think Paul was going to get married just because John was getting married, because John had been married before to Cynthia, and that didn't inspire Paul to marry anybody. There may have been, there may be something to it. They both had found the women who they saw as their soulmates.
In the Beatles episode, we talked about John having a heroin addiction. We talked about a bunch of tumultuous activity towards the 68, 69 period. One of the things that came through was Paul, he's got a controlling nature in the studio, telling people how to play various licks. How much of this war between the three Beatles and Paul do you think was payback for Paul's controlling nature in the studio?
Yeah, I don't think so. The controlling nature, in a way, he probably had that more than the others, but John and George, when they were doing their songs, probably were in control too. There are different musicians come in many different forms, and some are just completely collaborative and will bring in an idea and then let anybody contribute to it, anything they want. And some people, like Paul, know what they want, and they want the others to contribute specific things. I think the battle between them really was mostly about Alan Klein.
At the beginning of 1969, the Beatles began to consider a new management structure. Both Linda's father and another New York City native accountant, Alan Klein, were both considered as candidates. John Lennon favored Klein because Lennon was impressed that Klein knew and understood Lennon's lyrics. It called Klein very intelligent and felt he was tougher and more street smart than the upper class Lee Eastman. McCartney wanted Eastman, but was outvoted 3-1 as George Harrison and Ringo Starr sided with Lennon and Klein. So maybe the battle was more about Paul trying to bring in a family member, an in-law.
Yeah, it's an aspect of that. Alan Klein turned up at the end of what were the Let It Be sessions or Get Back sessions, and John was completely taken with him and said, Alan Klein's going to do my stuff. Whatever you guys want to do is fine with me. And then George and Ringo went with John on that. At the time, the Eastmans were representing the Beatles legally. They weren't managing them, but they had an official position in the Beatles company. Paul felt that if we're going to have Alan Klein, who he had heard quite a lot about Alan Klein's reputation, and said to the others, listen, I don't think that he's going to be good for us. I think basically he'll end up just taking everything we have. Because in a certain way, that's what he had done with the Rolling Stones. He renegotiated a contract with Decca for them, and then suddenly he owned their masters for everything up to Sticky Fingers. Mm-hmm. Sam Cooke and other artists had similar experiences, and Paul had heard about this and he warned the others. Now, from Paul's point of view, it wasn't necessarily Klein or the Eastmans. There were other people they talked to. There were other people that Paul recommended, other British businessmen. John went to meet some of them and wasn't impressed. But in a way, the others took it that way, because there's a 1970 interview with George where George says, listen, three of us wanted to do one thing and one of us wanted to do something else. And the problem is that the three of us don't have to go home to it every day. So that was a pretty clear indication that they at least felt that Paul was pushing the Eastmans. And you could understand why, if you're in a partnership, you don't want one person's in-laws as your manager.
As we discussed in our Beatles Garage to Stadiums episode, the precipitous decline of the Beatles was not helped by the fact that the other three Beatles, other than Paul, signed a contract with American accountant Alan Klein, giving him management control of their company, Apple Corp. It was a game-changing moment for Paul because up until now, big decisions always required unanimity rather than a simple vote. Every member used to have a veto, not this time. McCartney's words seem to sum up this period perfectly. That was the night we broke the Beatles, and it never came back after that one. John Lennon lets it be known that he wants to leave the Beatles in September 1969, but he's convinced by Alan Klein to keep it quiet, while Klein is negotiating a new Beatles contract with the record distributor EMI. who was the distributor for the Beatles' own Apple Records, which the group had started back in 1968. This battle rages on as Paul is trying to prepare to release his first album on Apple Records. Paul wants to release his album in April, but is contractually tied to Apple. But Apple has several Beatles-related albums being released, the Hey Jude compilation, Ringo's solo albums, and the Let It Be album. John and George write Paul a letter telling him they are bumping his album release date to not conflict with the release of Let It Be. Ringo hand delivers the letter to Paul, and Paul goes ballistic, shouting at Ringo and throws him out of the house. Next, Paul McCartney walks away from the wreckage of the Beatles to release his first album, and the world responds.
Garage to Stadiums, telling the stories of how our music legends have moved from obscurity to global fame.
Paul calls John and tells him, "I'm leaving," on April 9th, 1970, and proceeds to quit the Beatles. Also in April of that year, Alan Klein starts to play a major role in the album Let It Be, which was released after the Beatles breakup, and this causes major friction as Klein hires Phil Spector, who is famous for lush productions called The Wall of Sound, to overlay major orchestration over the songs that Paul and others wrote. Paul is furious. Paul's first album, simply entitled McCartney and containing the classic Maybe I'm Amazed, is released in April 1970. It goes to #1 in the US and #2 in UK. Several songs are about Linda, including The Lovely Linda, Maybe I'm Amazed. Linda provides backing vocals on the album. Is he following Lennon's lead of including his spouse here, purposely or subconsciously?
Paul definitely liked the idea that John had of collaborating with his wife. Obviously, the kind of collaboration is completely different. Yoko was an avant-gardist and was pushing John in that direction, and Linda was sort of a rock and roll girl, and Paul was still leading what was going on. She was providing backing vocals and things like that. So it's a different kind of collaboration, but you may be right about there being an influence. I think possibly John working with Yoko was inspiring to Paul in terms of wanting Linda in the band.
Weeks after McCartney's first album is released, the Beatles release Let It Be. It goes to #1 in the US, knocking out Paul's first album, and it goes to #1 in the UK as well. And then more Beatles Paul interaction as Paul files a lawsuit against John, George, Ringo, and Apple Corp to dissolve the Beatles' 1967 partnership agreement. And the bitterness spills over into the press. In the first of a two-part Lennon interview in Rolling Stone, John is very critical of Paul musically, calling his album rubbish and says insulting things about Paul and the Eastman family. A non-album single, Another Day, Paul's first single, it's top 5 worldwide in February of 1971. And in keeping with the war raging on the Beatles' front lines, Paul times this single to be released on the same day as the hearing begins, and Paul appeared in high court. The next album that Paul and now Linda McCartney released in June 1971, called Ram, has Too Many People, Uncle Albert, Admiral Halsey, which went to #1 in the US, #2 in the UK. It actually won a Grammy. But with that Ram album, there was a lot of negative reviews despite these achievements. McCartney was very sensitive to bad reviews of his albums. Did that surprise you in your research, given that he was already a legend in the songwriting department?
Yeah, it didn't surprise me because all creators are sensitive to reviews. I've talked to a great many over the years, and one thing I found is that the more a composer or performer says, "I don't read reviews," the more obsessed they are with their reviews. Paul likes to be liked. Not that everybody doesn't in a way. Paul really likes that, and he has a public creative life, and he wants what he puts out there publicly to be liked. And so when it gets a bad review, and certainly in a lot of cases, people were scathing in some of the reviews. There was a British critic named Charles Shar Murray who reviewed Venus and Mars, and his article was titled something like, "What do you say to a Beatle who's done a rubbishy album?" or something like that. And that bothered Paul so much that he mentioned it in an interview as late as 2015, and that
Wow.
was in 1975. So it didn't surprise me that bad reviews bothered him.
That's an interesting segue to my next question, which would
Hmm.
be Too Many People. The song on that Ram album has references to John as part of their musical war. They wrote songs back and forth a little bit, John particularly. Other songs were also interpreted on that album as being attacks on John or the Beatles. What's your view of this battle? You talked about Paul wanting to be liked, yet he does kind of dip his fingers in the mud here to sling it at John, seemingly. What is your view on that?
Yeah, Paul didn't do it quite as much as John did. And when he did, it was a little more subtle. Too Many People is basically just saying too many people going underground and telling you what you should believe, but you should believe what you want to believe. John's response to that, "How do you sleep?" was really far more vicious. The only thing you've done was yesterday, and since you're gone, you're just another day, which is a reference to his first solo single. And Paul's was a little more sub rosa than John's. Some of the things on Ram that John took as attacks weren't even necessarily meant as attacks. For instance, in the sort of play out of "Backseat of My Car," he says, "We believe that we can't be wrong." Now, that sort of fits into the song itself, which is basically just about a guy and a girl who want to run away from their parents, drive down to Mexico, and make out in their car. But John took it as, "We believe that we can't be wrong and you are wrong." So that's an interpretive thing that may not have actually been there in Paul's writing.
Linda was credited with co-writing 6 songs on the album, and many of these early songwriting efforts by Paul are credited to Linda as well. You probably have a view on that and why that happened. It was less about probably her songwriting ability and probably more about money.
Yeah, that's very possible. He's never admitted that, and it's very possible that Linda did contribute to these songs. But the thing is, in practical financial terms, Paul was signed to Northern Songs publisher, which basically had signed him and John as a partnership, Lennon-McCartney. And so the royalties were split between Northern Songs, Lennon, and McCartney. If Paul wrote with Linda, then that means there'd be Paul's songwriting royalties, but also Linda would be getting a songwriting royalty. So they would be getting a bit more that way than if it was just Paul on his own. So there is that possibility. And the problem was that even though Paul sued the others to get out of Apple in 1971, it took until 1975 for that to be settled. And all of Paul's royalties or recording royalties went into Apple, and that includes the albums he made on his own and the albums he made with Wings. So he wasn't getting that money. So getting the publishing royalties arranged in a way that would bring in a bit more was probably a useful thing for him, because he was basically paying Wings salaries, and he was paying for the equipment and the details of the touring that Wings was doing. He was underwriting that. So he needed an income stream from somewhere, since his recording royalties were going to Apple. So very complicated. You need like an MBA to sort through some of this stuff.
Paul decides to expand into a band and begins interviewing various musicians. One is his friend Denny Lane, who is in the band The Moody Blues. Another is Denny Sywell. He decides on the name Wing. What's the significance of the name Wings?
What he said was they were thinking of a name at the time that Linda was in the hospital having their second daughter, Stella. Actually, the third daughter, because Linda had a daughter from a previous marriage who Paul adopted. So that was now his daughter. And Mary and then Stella was the third of their 4 children. Right. And it was a difficult birth. and he was out in the waiting room and saw some image of an angel and saw the wings, and somehow Wings struck him as a great name for a group. And so they became Wings. There were all kinds of ideas that were brooded about before he came up with Wings, the Paul McCartney Blues Band and stuff like that, which it wasn't really a blues band, so it wouldn't have made sense. There were a lot of names that were kind of silly, and Wings really does have a ring to it. So it became Wings.
This new formation, which includes Paul, Linda, Denny Lane, and Denny Sywell, start recording the next album at EMI London. The Dennys are told they're equal partners in the new unnamed band, but that needed to be worked out with the Eastmans. For the time being, they're paid £70 a week and no contract, just a handshake. In December 1971, the next album is released, and it's now under the name Wings, called Wildlife. And it contains the songs Dear Friend and Wildlife, the title track. There was negative reviews in general, including from George Harrison, who called the album crummy. It included some unfinished songs from the Ram sessions, but Dear Friend is an olive branch song to John Lennon. Release of the album was also delayed to Paul's insistence that no Apple Corp logo appear on the album, which was disputed by EMI and Apple. Paul won and later sent one of the infamous short letters in the history of rock and roll to Alan Klein saying, "Dear Pig, quote, you have nothing to do with my affairs, so keep out of them and fuck off. Signed, PM." 1971 was a pretty massive year for music. The Stones, Sticky Fingers, Joni Mitchell, Blue, The Doors, LA Woman, David Bowie had Hunky Dory, John Lennon, Imagine, Marvin Gaye, What's Going On, Led Zeppelin 4. It could go on and on. In your opinion, how did McCartney's 71 albums, Ram and Wildlife, match up to some of the classic albums? Not to mention the solo efforts released by other Beatles.
Sure. Ram at the time was, as you said, pretty badly reviewed, and it wasn't considered quite in the same league in terms of hitness as most of those albums that you mentioned. But since then, it's really survived very well, and it stands up to listening now as a representative of that period, but it's very personal to Paul in a way. It's not Led Zeppelin 4, and it's a very different kind of album. I think it stands up very well. Wildlife maybe a bit less so, because with Wildlife, when he got that first version of Wings together with the two Dennys, Linda, they rehearsed for a weekend and then went to London to Abbey Road and started recording, and they made the album really quickly.
Wanted to take a method on that, didn't they? They just said, well, one take.
It wasn't entirely true. There was overdubbing and there was editing. When you say one take, it sounds almost as if they've gone into the studio and just played it, and that's the album. That's what they put out that they did, but it wasn't quite as simple as they said. And in volume 1 of McCartney Legacy, we go through all the sessions and exactly what was done, and people can see that it wasn't just one take and that's it. Actually, the thing about Wildlife too is it hasn't quite attained the reputation that Ram has, but it too has survived, I think, better than I would have expected at the time when it came out. There are a number of songs on side 2, Some People Never Know, things like that, and that are really quite nice, carefully made songs with nice arrangements and well performed. And I think that maybe people think a lot more of the stuff on side 1, like Mumbo and the title song and all that, as being a little bit more ramshackle, and that's the reputation that album has had. But it's actually, if you revisit it, it's a little better than you may remember.
We move on to the next single that he releases in February 72, Give Ireland Back to the Irish. Paul wasn't known necessarily for politically themed songs, unlike John. Why do you think this one?
Well, he is of Irish descent, and he was sitting in his home in London listening to the news when Bloody Sunday happened in Ireland, which was basically a massacre of protesters by the British Army. Massacre might be extreme, but that's the way it was taken at the time. People were killed, and it offended Paul as an English person of Irish descent. He basically, had a dog on both sides of this fight, but didn't think that these two sides should be fighting, and felt that the British government should really stand down on that. It is Ireland, give it back to the Irish. It caused him a lot of trouble. EMI tried to get him not to put it out. A lot of stores refused to carry it. Radio stations refused to play it. And even when he went on his university tour, a lot of students would come up to him afterwards and say, "So are you supporting the IRA now?" Which was not what the song was saying. But yeah, there was something about it that, he even said at the time, "Yeah, I don't normally like protest songs. I don't like political songs, but this was important to him."
Point about his Irish heritage, of course, that would hit a little bit harder. When he starts touring, he wants to do the smaller tours. They literally are in a van driving around England. He wanted no publicity, just show up and play. They were playing UK universities. What do you think he was trying to accomplish with the back to basics? Start small? Was there something else going on? And then something strange happened at Leeds University. Can you just comment on that sort of tour and what was the genesis of it?
I think he did want to start small, and he wanted to start unheralded, the way you would do a show out of town before bringing it to Broadway. He wanted the band to get some playing experience, but without being totally in the national limelight, which they were going to be because it was him. He wanted to start a new band, and he wanted to start it kind of like the Beatles and grow into it. But he realized that he's still Paul McCartney. He's still very well known. He's not going to be able to just turn up and do a quiet show and gain the experience and not have it be the focus of national, international attention. By the time they turned up at Leeds, the press was there, photographers, everybody was waiting for him. And so they just drove away and then came back to Leeds like 4 or 5 days later and did an impromptu concert, which is what they wanted to do. But the thing is that this idea of just getting in a van and driving around is something that went back to the Beatles, not just the early Beatles when that was the way they did it, but around the time of the Get Back, Let It Be sessions, Paul was pushing this idea. Why don't we just do some concerts in a small club? And John said, "You're daft. Can't do that." But this is it. It's just Paul. I think the university tour in a way was Paul working out finally an idea that he brought up towards the end of the Beatles as something he wanted to do. And here he now had his new band and he was going to do it that way.
There's the beginnings in 1972 of financial friction. There's no contract yet for the band. The band are still on the retainer of £70 per week, and they receive a small share of tours. Drummer Danny Sywell and guitarist Henry McCullough are not happy, only making union wages for their sessions. Sywell was making way more as a New York session man. He'd go back to New York City to do session work when there were breaks with Wings to supplement his income. Paul agrees to a 7-year extension in mid-1972 to his publishing contract with Northern Songs. End of this legal battle unlocks Linda's royalties, and they begin to roll in because they were under dispute in a court order by Northern Songs due to Paul trying to go around the company with Linda's royalty flow. And Paul buys the Lamborghini, but the other members of the Wings still can't afford a car. Money becomes a taboo subject within the band. In June 72, he agrees to a 7-year extension of his publishing contract with ATV Northern Songs, the company that you mentioned before. And as a quote, "all differences have been settled amicably," as a press release. It unlocked Linda's royalties. They began to roll in, or unlocked royalties in general began to roll in. Paul buys a Lamborghini. The other members of the Wings still can't afford a car because money still has not been settled relative to them being paid, I don't know, £70 a week, something like that.
Right.
Can you comment on the degree of tension in the band over being paid this amount, still not being made a full member of the band. This must have been an irritant daily, weekly, etc.
It kind of was, to an extent at least. The way Denny Sywell explained it was that when they got together that first weekend before they recorded Wildlife to form the band, that basically Paul had said, okay, this is going to be an equal band. Everyone will contribute and everyone will share in the spoils. And they had what Denny called a hippie handshake. And then because they were just starting, Paul decided to put them on a retainer, which was, as you say, 70 pounds a week. And Denny Sywell was a very successful studio drummer in New York, and he gave that up to go to London and Scotland. They went back and forth to work with Wings on the theory that it is Paul McCartney, this could become big. It became big, but he was still getting the 70 pounds a week in 1973 when he finally left. Paul would sometimes give them bonuses for various things, but he did find that when he had a couple of weeks off, he would have to fly back to New York and do some studio work. Yeah, that it was an issue. It wasn't the only issue, but because there was also an issue that was a little familiar from the Beatles days with Henry McCulloch, the lead guitarist, not wanting to be told all the time what notes to play in his solos. And in one instance, in My Love, which came out in 1973, he said, couldn't I just try my idea just once? If it doesn't work, we'll do it your way. And Paul said, oh, well, okay, fine. And he did it. And that is an exquisitely beautiful guitar solo. And Paul was the first to admit that. But then right before they broke up, before Band on the Run, exactly the same thing happened. It was at a rehearsal. Henry McCulloch wanted to play his own idea for a solo. Paul said no. They had an absolute blowout. Henry packed up his stuff and quit the band. The finances had a lot to do with it, but it wasn't the only thing. There were other frustrations within that first version of Wings.
Yeah. Is this kind of a repeat a little bit of the Beatles tensions, treating bandmates as sidemen, being overbearing? But I guess that's Paul's nature. He just wants it to be perfect in his mind.
Yeah, he wants it to be the way he wants it to be. Paul, in that way, is like a classical composer. A classical composer writes down the notes that an orchestra or a string quartet or whatever is going to play, and that's what he expects to hear. And with Paul, he's not writing it down, but he has in his mind a very definite idea of what he wants to hear. And at least in that version of Wings, he wasn't that flexible about it. So that did cause that kind of issue. And you're right. We did see some of that in the Beatles as well. There's that scene in Let It Be with George saying, I'll play anything you want, or I won't play at all. Whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it.
In March 1973, the other three Beatles tell Klein his contract will not be renewed. This seems to help mend tensions between Paul and the other Beatles. Let's say that possibly Paul's suspicions about Helen Klein were right, said John Lennon. Next, legal battles begin to be resolved, and Paul pushes forward with new albums, and the producers of James Bond make a surprise offer.
Kick back, relax, and enjoy your trip from the garage to global stadiums.
The next album by Paul and Wings is in April of 1973, and it's called Red Rose Speedway, which contains the #1 hit, My Love. And this is followed by a non-album single in June 73 called Live and Let Die, which becomes the title track for a James Bond movie of the same title. And it was nominated for a Best Song at the Oscars. McCartney was a noted control freak, and that came out loud and clear during our Beatles episode. So it's no surprise that as rehearsals for the next album begin in August 1973, that Paul is up to his old drill sergeant ways by controlling most aspects of everyone's playing. And accordingly, a couple of members of the band, drummer Danny Sywell and guitarist Henry McCulloch, quit on McCartney due to escalating tensions around money and McCartney's controlling nature. Next, Paul, determined as ever, soldiers on with only Linda McCartney and Denny Lane in tow, and heads for an odd destination to record a rock album which would become legendary.
Thanks for listening to Garage to Stadiums. Need more? Visit us on all social platforms and garagetostadiums.com for bonus content. Another Blast Furnace Labs production.